My name is Oliver Schnusenberg. I think I'm probably the only one on here from the US. So I'm originally from Germany. I've been in the States for 35 years now. I left Germany 2 months before the Berlin Wall fell, so a long, long time ago. I teach finance at the University of North Florida, and I've done that for 21 years now, and it's in Jacksonville, Florida. My area is behavioral finance, which is psychology and financial decision making. And so through that work, I've become interested in the neuroscience underlying financial decision making. So behavioral finance deals primarily with psychology. At the University of North Florida, I developed a course in behavioral finance, and that was actually the first course of its kind undergraduate level in the state university system, so in the state of Florida. It's since then become kind of a staple also for the Certified Financial Planner exam. So that now has, since I think 2021, a behavioral finance component and section. But so in that course in behavioral finance, I always incorporate not only financial decision making and how to think about financial decision making from a psychological perspective, but also from a practical perspective within everyone's life. So how do you actually make decisions within your life, and how do you set those decisions intentionally? So there's an exercise that students do in that class that helps them identify their values. So what I wanted to do here is talk a little bit about, well, first of all, the culture I think we all find ourselves in right now, and I'll compare that with the culture and the times that I grew up with, and maybe some people in here grew up with. And so we all have a different story. So when I grew up in the 1980s, don't know if anyone else grew up then, but it actually doing this brought back some memories. So in Germany, we had, I remember, 3 TV channels. They were called appropriately 1, 2, and 3. And 3 was the worst, like no one ever watched 3. So 1 was, I think my favorite was probably 2nd. I don't remember why. There were times when there was just nothing on TV. We were not allowed to watch TV until evenings. But there were maybe, when I was entering my teens, some video games like Atari. I don't know if anyone remembers that, where you had to bounce the ball between the 2 bars. And then it may have been in the States. It wasn't a thing in Germany. I'm not sure if that's a thing in the UK. There were arcades that you went to play video games, Pac-Man and those things. But life was pretty calm. Now, that's not to say there weren't issues, right? Like we tend to glamorize everything. In the 80s, if you think back, there was the constant threat of nuclear war. That was obviously an issue and the problem. But in terms of technology, there were no smartphones, there were no cell phones, there was nothing like that. And then in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and by the way, in these pictures, the horse kind of represents life, and you are the rider of the horse. So, again, in the 1980s, just like a gentle walk. And then it got a little faster in the 1990s and maybe the early 2000s. So we had in the 1990s the arrival of the internet. I don't know if everyone remembers AOL. That was used both in Germany and here, I'm sure in the UK as well, which I always thought was funny because it's America Online. But if you remember the sound, I can't really do it, but when you connected through your phone line to go online, and it took like 10 minutes to actually be able to check your email. There were maybe some online games that you could do. There were educational CD-ROMs. And then, in the early 2000s, we maybe got some text messaging and Facebook and MySpace and those kinds of things where people were sharing their private stuff. And this is my life, and this is what I'm doing. And then in the 2010s, by the way, in 2007, the iPhone came on the scene, right? In the 2010s, now we have smartphones. In 2010, I believe, was the year when we had the ability that, in some people's opinion, was like changed a lot. The ability to rotate the camera to actually take pictures of ourselves, so selfies, and post those. Streaming services came online, mobile gaming. Everyone started to have a microphone, so life got pretty intense. And now it's like we don't really have control of anything anymore. We're not even on life anymore. Like life is riding us. or it's just running away from us, because everything in our environment is just demanding our constant attention. There's noise everywhere, and it's constant. It's news, it's streaming services, it's everything, right? So what happened? If you read a brilliant book, Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation, he basically talks about how there's several mechanisms by which children have been rewired, whether that is through sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, addiction to technology, loneliness and social isolation, and social comparison and perfectionism. And when people post online, that's maybe changed a little bit now, but when people post online, their life is glamorized, right? Like, they don't post the bad stuff in their life. It's only the good stuff that you see. So you think everybody else's life is perfect, and you're the problem, because your life may not be perfect, and you're like, well, what's wrong with me? Everybody else has this perfect life going on, right? So we live by basically what is thrown at us, rather than we're reactive to what is thrown at us. And you're seeing that just without making any political statement, but that's obviously not hard to guess, a hot potato here right now after the election. But everyone is trying to make their spin on what to think. Like, this is what you should think. This is what you should think. No, this is what you should think. Like, news media is not really news anymore. So most of news media is opinion, and I find that really sad. I grew up in a time when people would just come out and read the news, like, this is what happened, and now you can form your opinion. So it brings us to news. So there's a negativity bias in news, right? So the media focuses on negative headlines. And why? Well, because they sell. There was a study by Zhang et al. In 2024. They basically gave, I think this was about 120 people. They were young, an average of 22 years old, and they gave them 18 news headlines across 3 categories: financial, international, and social news. And they were selected for their positive or negative balance. So some were more positive and some were more negative. And then participants were presented with 6 headlines from each category in random order. And they were then instructed to select one headline they wanted to read. And what participants wanted to do, they wanted to read more the negative headlines. And that difference was significant. Like, it sells more to sell negative news. So in the second study, this was also interesting, participants generalize and amplify negative news. So in this study, this was 60 people. People read 3 negative news items and were then asked to provide a headline to summarize the main content for sharing. And the negativity degree of their wording was more pronounced than the negativity of the actual article. So we tend to amplify that information. So that I thought was really interesting. So definitely negativity in the news media. And that affects mental health, right? There's another study by Holman in 2014 that investigated the direct exposure. You may remember the Boston Marathon bombing, and indirect exposure. So they had people who were directly exposed to the bombings. So how is that defined? Well, that means either being near the site of the bombings, or having a close relationship with someone who was present, injured, or killed during the bombings, or being in the area affected by the lockdown imposed shortly afterwards. So what they did is an analysis of like who has more stress as a result of this, the people that were there or the people that were just exposed to media. And what they found is the people that were just reading the headlines were actually more affected. So they had a higher stress level, higher acute stress. So again, I don't know if that says something about the way it was reported, but if you were there, you actually know what happened and you know how bad it was, right? So I found that pretty fascinating. Now, so that, we all know this, can lead to chronic stress. And you can pretty much look at any neuroscientific textbook. But in this study from 2024, they make a point on the second slide. That's why I'm using this. But the HPA axis is the stress response, right? So that culminates in the adrenal glands releasing cortisol, and dampens the immune system, prepares the body for fight or flight. So chronic stress regulates the HPA axis, which over time impairs prefrontal cortex function. So it affects our thinking, especially the hippocampus, right, which has a ton of cortisol receptors. So that includes impulse control and emotional regulation. So if we're in toxic, constant stress, there's always, you imagine, just a constant hum in the background to our thoughts. Underlying everything we do is like a consistent stress level. So we're constantly on and we're constantly ready to fight. And I find that really scary, right? Like we are so exposed to just negativity and constant bombardment of negative news and of questioning ourselves that we are just in constant stress. And there's a lot of recent research on intergenerational trauma. That's not really part of this, but I find that interesting too. I just heard on a podcast, this was a few days ago, someone was mentioning that the intergenerational trauma, so that stress that is actually literally passed on through generations, can go back 8 generations. I don't know if you know what happened in your family 8 generations ago. I have no clue. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. We have our family tree traced back a long time, but I have no idea what happened 8 generations ago. So whatever that was can impact you now. And but anyway, this person was saying that in their research, they found that the stress was cumulative. So intergenerational trauma is not only passed on to like it's not only a faint echo, it gets stronger through the generations. So this is why I wanted to kind of mention this study. So in chronic stress, testosterone production is somewhat inhibited. So in a typical chronic stress, you have high cortisol and low testosterone. So that means people tend to be more passive or even submissive. But in acute stress, there is a higher testosterone to cortisol ratio. So that is more aggressive behaviors. And if you look at the general population when you're out and about, this seems to be true, right? It's either or. It's either people are just kind of existing or they're aggressive. At least that seems to be the case here. I think in Europe that maybe it's a little less pronounced, and then you have a lot of drug-induced behavior also playing a role in this. So why say all this? Well, I'm saying all this because this constant bombardment is just pulling us away from actually leading the life that we want to lead. We don't ever really ask ourselves what actually are our values. Like we don't have time to actually think about anything, right? Do we ever actually sit down and relax and think, right? So I'm going to now start talking about behavioral finance and financial intelligence, and then talk a little bit about the project that I use in my course. So behavioral finance, talked about this a little bit at the beginning. It's a study of how psychology affects investor behavior in financial markets. It relies on the assumption that investors and other financial decision makers do not always behave rationally, and instead often make choices based on cognitive biases or immediate emotional responses. So if you see the stock market crashing 1,000 points, your immediate instinct is to sell, right? Because our brain is wired that way. Your fight or flight response will kick in. You just want to get out, right? You just want to sell. And that, of course, is exactly what you should not be doing in finance. You should buy low and sell high, not sell low and buy high, right? So that's the same when people are talking about, oh, gold is up to whatever, $1,500 an ounce. This is a good time to buy. It's like, oh yeah, because it's expensive, right? That's like driving around looking for the gas station with the highest prices. So anyway, that is behavioral finance. Now, financial intelligence is the ability to make smart, values-based decisions with your money and your life. So the book Financial Intelligence by Lennick and Jordan, 2010, is really good. It's a very short book and it's a very easy read, but it is very impactful. And it really emphasizes the importance of aligning your financial decisions with your core values and your principles. So how can you combine the two? So for human behavior, behavioral finance would tell you how people with cognitive and emotional biases make decisions. And financial intelligence would say how people make decisions based on their core values and their principles. For behavioral biases and corrections, behavioral finance acknowledges that biases such as overconfidence, hindsight bias, like I always knew it was going to happen, and loss aversion, we had hate losses more than gains by a factor of about 2.5. Financial intelligence would try to correct those biases by aligning your decisions with your personal values and long-term goals. And that, as a practical application, provides a theoretical framework for understanding market behavior and investor psychology, but financial intelligence would focus on actionable steps to improve financial decision-making in real-life scenarios by applying theoretical knowledge to practical situations. So this sounds a little esoteric, so I wanted to give a couple of examples. So say you have an investor who experiences loss aversion. So they hate losses, kind of like Gordon Gekko, if you're familiar with him from Wall Street. There was one scene when he said to Bud Fox, Charlie Sheen's character, "I hate losses." So that's kind of Gordon Gekko, right? So investor experiences loss aversion, which is a bias, again, where they fear losses more than they value gains. So that can lead you in finance to hold on to poorly performing investments for too long. So you refuse to sell your losing investments because you don't want to take the loss. And it also, on the flip side, it causes people to sell their winning investments too early. So from a financial intelligence approach, the investor would try to align their decisions with their long-term values of financial security and growth. So they would use a values-based framework to regularly review their portfolio, focusing on their overall goals rather than emotional reactions to individual trades. Practically speaking, that may then mean that that investor sets a rule to rebalance their portfolio maybe quarterly based on data, not on their emotions. It's setting specific rules. And they would probably also be encouraged to work with a financial advisor who ensures that their decisions align with their core values. And maybe one more example, if you have someone who struggles with impulse spending. That's, by the way, a big thing right now in the area of financial therapy, which is identifying your money beliefs and money values and money triggers, and also your experiences and upbringing around money. But so say you have a person who struggles with impulse spending due to present bias, which means prioritizing short-term pleasures over your long-term goals. So behavioral finance would just say, okay, present bias causes people to overlook future financial needs in favor of immediate gratification. Financial intelligence would then say, okay, if you have identified your core values, say maybe as family and security, then maybe what you want to do is create a budget that ensures your spending aligns with your long-term goals, such as saving for a family vacation or a child's education or whatever it may be. So practically, then what you should do is maybe automate savings for long-term goals and create a fund that you can use for whatever you want, guilt-free. So behavioral finance and financial intelligence are very closely aligned. Now, it's hard for us to be intentional. This is probably both of these are one of my all-time favorite quotes. Like Carl Jung said a long time ago, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. So we have to know what's going on, right? About 95% of our everyday actions are unconscious, are driven by our unconscious mind, not by our conscious mind. So everything we do, it's the same stuff every day, right? 95% of it. Only 5% of what we do is conscious. The meditation was probably part of the 5%, right? Attention needs our attention. If you follow Andrew Huberman, I love Huberman Labs. It's a great podcast. It's long. He's very, very detailed in the neuroscience around basically anything. But he said this in a recent podcast, like intention needs our attention. So we need to learn to actually focus on intentionally making decisions. All right. So this leads us to what Lennick would call the alignment model. So which is 3 frames. So we have a moral compass on the one end, and then based on the moral compass, we set our purpose, goals, and wants, and then based on that, we live our lives, basically, right? That should guide our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions. So your moral compass is what are your most important principles and values? And your goals are what do you want to accomplish personally and professionally? And your behavior would then be, well, what decisions will you make and what concrete actions will you take to achieve your goals? And you can see that, well, as we've talked about, social media pulls us increasingly into just reactive behaviors, thoughts, and emotions. We're focused on momentary actions and reactions rather than long-term values or beliefs. Over time, that will lead to cognitive dissonance that our behaviors and thoughts don't align with our personal beliefs and values. That's why we're also depressed, right? Because we do things and we know we really don't want to be doing that. We really don't want to be looking at TikTok videos for 2 or 3 hours a day. We want to be doing something else, but we're not, right? Like it's just kind of controlling us. So striving to keep up with external expectations and online trends leads to acting in ways that feel misaligned with core values, right? So a practical example here. Think about a professional who deeply values integrity and family. So that would be your frame one. They believe in being honest and prioritize spending time with their loved ones. So that leads to frame two. Their goal and their purpose is maybe to provide financial stability and build a secure future for their family. That's great. That works. So that to achieve this, they aim to excel in their career and earn a promotion, which they believe will allow them to support their family better, right? Which then leads to frame three, their behavior, thoughts, and emotions. So now their actions involve consistently working late hours, cutting corners to meet deadlines, and justifying small dishonest behaviors at work. Like everyone does it, and they rationalize those behaviors by telling themselves that those sacrifices are necessary for the promotion. So that's an obvious misalignment, right? So the dishonesty at work conflicts with their value of integrity, and them putting in that many hours actually results in not spending time with their family. So they're undermining their own values, okay? So as a result, they feel guilty and stressed, creating inner conflict between their real self, which is their current actions, and their ideal self, which is their self aligned with their values and goals. So what's the resolution? Well, to realign, they can reflect on how their actions impact their values and adjust by setting boundaries at work, prioritizing time with their family, and finding ethical ways to achieve their career goals. But again, this all requires intention and not just living the life. Interesting. All right. So I put the link here. There's multiple websites that allow you to identify your values, but this is a values exercise. And I don't know if you have ever actually done this. So if you've ever identified your own values. I have, and it's an interesting exercise. And you don't need to use values cards like this. You can just sit down and think, well, what are my values, right? But this is going to be small print. I apologize for this. But these are the 50 values that are on those cards. So you can see there's adventure, autonomy, challenges, change, community, competition, competence, and so on, down to safety, security, spirituality, service, status, wealth, work. So whatever your values are, right? So students in this project, this is what they start with. So they start identifying their values. And then they're asked these questions. So what is your purpose? What are your talents? Like, what are you good at? And what are you passionate about? What do you obsess about? Like, what do you really want to do? What do you wish you had more time to put energy into? What needs doing in the world that you'd like to put your talents to work on? What are the main areas in which you'd like to invest your talents? And what environments or settings feel most natural to me? And in what work and life situations are you most comfortable expressing your talents? So what is your environment? What are you good at? And how do you function, right? And where would you like to be useful, right? And, I can tell I work with quite a few Gen Z clients, and in talking with them, they are not used to taking control. They're not used to actively thinking because they're so used to just being told this is what you should think, right? So then they're asked, okay, now, do you currently live in alignment? Do you actually act in accordance with your purpose and your values and your goals? Are you actually doing that? And what could you change right now to align your frames better? So it's asking them to be very intentional and thoughtful about how can you live according to what your values are. What I've done for this is I'm doing this every semester, but I've just pulled 2 semesters, and I did an analysis of the male versus female values to see how they line up. And it looked at, they are overlapping, 4 of them are overlapping. So family and health, top 2 for both. But then for the male students was integrity, independence, and education. And for the female students, it was friendship, education, and independence. So education and independence kind of line up. So the only thing that's different here is integrity for male students and friendship for female students. Now, by the way, this does not mean, obviously, that friendship doesn't matter to the male students and integrity doesn't matter to the female students. It's just, their top values. And for this small sample of 61 students. So that aligns, though. I thought that was very interesting. The Pew Research Center in November 2021 asked what makes life meaningful. And so you can see that family and children and physical and mental health are top, career is top, well-being, friends and community. So there's a lot of overlap just between my students and in general. So do you live in alignment? So for the male students, a majority expressed that they are mostly living in alignment with their values, although many noted areas for improvement. So a lot of them thought, okay, I can be better aligned by focusing on financial management, on career planning, and focusing on personal development. So some were only partially aligned. So I said, well, this is what I want to do, but I can't do it right now, either because I'm a student. And that brings up another point. Obviously, your values change over a course of a lifetime, right? So if I had to give this one name, I would say progress. So they focus more on progress. Whereas for the female students, they focus more on balance. So their common challenges were more financial stability. That's the same academic and career advancement, and maintaining personal relationships. So more balance for the male students, probably more progress, which probably also creates more pressure. So better alignment for them could come through better time management for the most part for this small sample, is what they said. A lot of them have goals related to career advancement, personal growth, financial success, but they also notice time constraints. And for the female students, a common theme was they can be better aligned by prioritizing self-care and personal boundaries. So again, a small sample here. So what could you do if you talk to young people today during regular conversation? Ask them values-based questions, right? Like, what's been meaningful to you lately? Or what are you most proud of this week? Or also stimulate critical thinking about their behavior, whether that aligns, right? So what are you doing right now? Does this align with what matters to you? How does that align? Like if you notice something where it maybe doesn't, right? Or what impact do you hope to have by doing this or by thinking this way? Or point out implied values, like maybe they don't think about values, but so maybe if they say something that makes you think, well, they seem to be very loyal, just state that, right? I can see how much loyalty means to you. It's inspiring how you prioritize your friendships. So and that's motivating as well, reinforcing that value. And then, of course, we can all do is lead by example. Demonstrate your values through everyday actions, whether it's kindness, integrity, or compassion, and mention them naturally when relevant. So this was just a brief example of something that I do in a course to try to have people live a more intentional life rather than just being a passive participant in life. Because people have a lot to give. It's just figuring out what they have to give and where that's most useful.